computador, mas na nuvem.
Beleza,
Vamos lá.
Já está gravando.
Maravilha, maravilha. Uhum.
Shriya, do you mind if we record the session?
Not at all. That's absolutely fine.
Very good. Great. Thank you. Perfect. Very good. Fantastic. So I believe we can start. So are you ready? So, okay, great. So today we are very happy to have Sriya Iyer here presenting for us a new paper on religion in India. Sriya is a professor of economics at the University of Cambridge, so Cambridge University, and she is one of the world's leading experts in the economics of religion. She has many papers and books reading on the subject, and I'm very, very happy to have her. And Sriya, thank you so much for accepting. And you have 1 hour and 30 minutes. And if you don't mind, we usually bother you in the middle with questions. So yes, so please, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
That's absolutely fine. And, thank you so much, Raphael, and, others there for the very kind invitation to be able to give a seminar to you all. Many years ago, I did my first paper on Brazil with Mario Monteiro, who's a Brazilian demographer, and at that time became very fascinated with the country and the various issues there. Of course, subsequently went on to work on India, but it's really a privilege to have the chance to speak, to interact with all of you in Sao Paulo. So the subject of my paper is economic shocks and temple desecrations in medieval India. And this is work that is joined with Anand Shrivastava and Rohit Ticku. Anand Shrivastava is based at the Azim Premji University in Bangalore in India. And Rohit Ticku, until recently, was in Chapman University in the US and is now moved to the European University Institute in Florence. This is very much a collaboration of people based in different parts of the world. Now, for those who, I know Raphael has been very kind in his introduction, but for those who haven't had a chance to meet before, I'm a development economist, and I have interests in demography, education, health, inequality, religion, and conflict. And for the past 15 years, I've been researching this area, this subfield of economics that we call the economics of religion, to which many scholars have contributed, including Raphael and others. And basically all of my research till now has been pretty much on contemporary development. So whether looking primarily at India, but I've also written on Bangladesh, Kenya, the couple of projects on Brazil, the UK, and the US. And because a lot of the work has been on contemporary development, this particular paper, which I'm going to be talking about today, is actually a bit of a first for me, because it's also on the economics of religion, but it's using historical data. So in some ways, it's a small foray for me into economic history. So that's also been quite a learning experience for me and my co-authors. But the issues that this paper is concerned with does in fact reflect three big concerns, which I think are also very relevant to contemporary development economics, because it tries to link religious conflict, economic shocks, and climate change with particular implications for development. So in today's talk, what I'm going to do, just to provide a quick roadmap, is I'm going to first talk a little bit about how we think there is a link between weather shocks and temple desecrations. For those who may be less familiar with this area, I'm going to say a little bit about Indian history and Indian religious policy, because that has relevance to the question. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our data, our empirical framework, the various mechanisms and alternatives that are influencing our thinking. And then perhaps if I get a little time at the end, say a little bit about robustness checks. So at the beginning and at the outset, I think the first question you all are probably thinking when faced with the title of this paper is, why should really we be interested in the issue of temple desecrations at all? And the reason we're arguing in this paper that economists and others should be interested in this is because we have seen the destruction of religious sites observed across cultures and across time, whether it is the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001, the destruction of sites by the Taliban in Iraq and Syria, the destruction of certain sites during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the destruction of the Babri Masjid Mosque in India in 1992. Across cultures, across time, you've actually seen the destruction of religious sites. And most of the literature in this area that has been talking about the desecration of religious sites, the explanations that are provided for why this actually happens tends to be mostly cultural or political. So, sociologists, political scientists, others historians have written a lot about the destruction of religious sites in different contexts, but they tend to provide, mainly cultural and political explanations for why this might actually be happening. Now, this, of course, is a historical phenomena, but, very tragically, it's also been brought to our attention most recently in the last few weeks. This is just an example on the slide here. Since the invasion began, although we're, of course, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we're actually thinking about, many other tragic and difficult issues. One of the things that has perhaps not been highlighted so much, but which has also happened, is that Russia is accused of damaging or destroying about 59 religious sites across Ukraine. That includes an Orthodox cathedral, Jewish schools, as well as parish churches. And a picture here on the slide is simply the priest of a village near Kyiv who is standing inside his destroyed church. This was from a BBC News report on the 31st of March this year. So the issue of temple desecrations, is not just a historical issue. It's actually something that is happening across different parts of the world in more contemporary contexts as well. So we thought this was an issue that bared further investigation. Where we feel that we can try to make a little bit of a contribution is to ask whether, to these broader discussions about culture and politics and history and so forth, does economics actually help contributing to this, to understanding this phenomena? And so what we're arguing in this paper is that economics might matter and to the issue of temple desecrations. And so what we're doing in this paper is to investigate the relationship between economic shocks and temple desecrations in medieval India with a panel in 213 locations across 54 decades. Now, I should mention here that for those who may be less familiar with Indian history, there's a lot of research in Indian history that talks about the colonial period in India. So that is when the British came to India and ruled over India for 200 years. Now, this period that we are looking at is before the British. It is basically in the Mughal period. So it's from 1192 to 730, before the British were in India. And this period for, economics of religion in India is, I think, comparatively not studied at all. There is, one paper by Saumitra Jha that again is also looking at the colonial period as well. But just looking at the medieval context in India has actually not been done by economists. So we thought this was interesting to look at. Now, one of the things that we should probably define up front is what exactly do we mean by a temple desecration? And here, the definition of a temple desecration that we're taking is pretty much what the historians, notably Richard Eaton, who has worked on this, is a famous historian from the University of Arizona. He defines a temple desecration as when a temple is looted, redefined, or destroyed. And what does that mean? So in the Indian city of Puri, for example, in 1359, the temple was basically, the idol of the temple was sacked and the temple was looted. So that's an example of looting. In the Indian city of Orcha in 1635, the whole temple itself was destroyed and razed to the ground. So that's what we mean by a temple being destroyed. And then in the Indian city of Mathura in 1670, you basically have the temple being completely destroyed, and then a Hindu temple being completely destroyed, and a Muslim structure called an Idgah being built by the Mughal emperor on top of that. So all of these are instances of temple desecration, either if a temple is looted or if it is redefined, or if it is destroyed, according to the historians. So we go with their definition. And we argue in our paper that this kind of religious repression may in fact be a kind of state maintenance strategy. And the reason we're arguing this is simply because there is an existing literature within economics, as we all know, that's been looking at the effect of weather shocks on conflict in pre-modern societies. But there's also a more recent literature, notably among economic historians in our profession, that's been looking at religion and politics under authoritarian rule, or specifically focused, whether it's in the European context or other context, on the persecution of minorities. So there are some very famous papers, for example, by Eric Cheney, which was published in Econometrica, where he was looking at Nile shocks and what that was doing to the relationship between religion and politics in Egypt. There are theoretical models by Jean-Philippe Plateau and Emmanuel Auriol, who was looking at, again, the relationship between religion and politics in Islam. Anand Shrivastava and I did another paper where we were looking at the relationship between riots and politics in India. And of course, most recently, Noel Johnson and Mark Koyama have written a beautiful book, which I wrote an article about in the JEL a couple of weeks ago, which was really talking about the persecution of minorities in medieval European societies, and they were focusing largely on persecution of Jewish minorities. But it's a wonderful book. So clearly there's a lot of recent literature that economists have been looking at with respect both to weather shocks as well as to this relationship between religion and politics. And what a lot of this literature is arguing, and which we are also arguing as well, is that economic shocks in some way might just disrupt the political equilibrium and lead to the destruction of religious authority. So how do we actually sort of show this? So just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to show you.
Can I just clarify one
Yes.
thing? So
yes.
the reason you're interested in temple desecration is, of course, not only about the building itself, let's say, but it's about the changing power, right?
Yes,
so
and what it represents.
Is it about, so there is an economic shock and this disrupts the standing equilibrium, and then is it a changing power, or is it to take down the religion power and substitute for secular power, or what exactly is the meaning of this temple desecration?
Yes, it's a great question, Rafa and Alex. I have a slide in a minute where I'll sort of explain what the mechanism that we're thinking of. We're basically thinking of the mechanism as operating through hits to agricultural productivity and then the co-option or not of the religious authority by the political authority. That's the way in which we're, but I will have a slide to describe in just a second, if you're okay. But just to sort of highlight, what exactly I'm going to be arguing in the paper. Our main result is that there's going to be a positive relationship between weather fluctuations and the desecrations of Hindu temples under Muslim rule. I'm going to show you evidence that there's an increase in the likelihood of temple desecrations under Muslim rule, particularly during periods of large weather fluctuations. And I'll define that clearly in terms of what we mean by that. And the mechanism that we're really thinking about, and this kind of begins to make reference to Rafael's question, is that the weather shock essentially increases the risk of rebellion, which increases the power of the religious authority, which might lead to religious repression by the rulers. But let me explain why we think that this might actually happen. So what do we see is the link from weather shocks to temple desecrations? Now, I think one of the things that the existing literature has established is that, and this is the papers by Auriol and Plateau and others, is that we know that religious authority in different contexts legitimizes political rulers. So work by Jared Rubin, as well as others, has been talking a lot about the fact that in different contexts, whether Islamic or otherwise, religious authority has influence over political rulers. But at the same time, we would argue that religious authority also has influence over the masses. Why is that? Because in these historical societies, religious men usually were thought of as wise people who had values or upheld values, although they were also prone to corruption. At the same time, they did exert authority both over political leaders as well as over the masses. And what we're arguing is that, in the event of an adverse weather shock, because many many of these societies are primarily agricultural societies, you could actually see that the adverse weather shock might affect agricultural productivity. So in the event of a flood or a drought or some kind of adverse weather shock, it's very likely that this is actually going to affect agricultural productivity. However, in these societies that I'm going to be talking about, which is predominantly, historical South Asia, it was a Muslim ruler with a Hindu zamindar who was collecting taxes and patronizing temples. And the tax which people had to pay was based on the size of the holding, of the land holding, which basically means that if there was a shock to agricultural productivity and people couldn't pay their taxes, there was potential that this increased the risk of rebellion by the masses. Now, if you have a situation where there's potentially risk of rebellion by the masses, normally in such a situation, and you think about, where will religious authority, influence the outcome, the religious authority can do one of two things. They can either coordinate the rebellion or they can hinder the rebellion. If we believe that they have authority over and influence over the masses as well as over the state, they are in a position to either, coordinate a rebellion or hinder a rebellion. And that means that in this kind of situation, it could be that this increases the power of the religious authority over political rulers. So political rulers will sense if there's a rebellion that's going to happen, that the religious clerics, for example, may have something, would be in a position to influence the masses, whether they should rebel or not. Now, this mechanism has been suggested before by other authors who've looked at other contexts. But mainly when the research has been done looking at the power of the religious authorities over political rulers, the option that is usually considered is this one here, where the political authority and the religious authority belong to the same religion. And so invariably what happens is that you have the co-option of religious authority by the political rulers to dampen the rebellion. So it could be, as Eric Cheney's paper in Egypt pointed out, that there's more spending on religious structures. The head religious judge doesn't get removed because the political authority is trying to co-opt the religious authority to dampen the prospect of a rebellion. What we're looking at, though, is the situation in countries like India, South Asia, where the religious authority and the political authority don't belong to the same religion, but actually belong to different religions, where the clerics are essentially the rulers are essentially Muslim, but the clerics are essentially Hindu. The dominant religion is Hindu. And so in such a situation where the religious and the political authority belong to different religions, it could be that the cost of co-option is so high that they're not actually able to co-opt the religious authority. And in that situation, we argue you might actually see religious repression instead in the form of temple desecration. So that's the way in which we argue is, we think there is a link between having the adverse weather shock and why it might actually be linked in this particular society, at least, to religious repression in the form of temple desecrations. Now, I mentioned that the political authority and the religious authority are different in the Indian context because I appreciate that some of you may not be as aware of the Indian history and how this has panned out. Let me just very briefly in one slide just do a whistle-stop tour of Indian history under Islamic rule. And apologies to any historians who might be here. I'm reducing 500 years of history to 5 points. But essentially, this is what happened. In India, Islam was introduced to India in the early 8th century through trade. Islamic expansion begins in India in the 11th century. By the end of the 12th century, the Persian Turks established the first Muslim state in India, and that is the Turkish slave dynasty. That slave dynasty then gives way to the Mughal dynasty in the early 16th century. And then for the next 2 centuries, these Mughals had an empire, which is the one that I'm going to talk about today, which exceeded in wealth and influence any contemporary state in the Islamic world. So we're talking about a major empire that essentially existed for 200 years. And then the Mughal power waned in the 18th century. It ceded space to many regional powers like the Rajputs, the Marathas, the Sikhs, and the Jats. And then, of course, thereafter came the British. So that's really how the Mughals fit into the grand scheme of Indian history. Now, in this period, in the period of the Mughals, as well as these regional powers, temples were a great source of religious legitimacy for Hindu rulers. So in South India, for example, there was a very famous king called Krishnadevaraya who ruled over the kingdom of Vijayanagar between 1509 and 1529. He was known for building lots of temples. He was also known for building mosques for his Muslim soldiers. And, in many cases, temples were a great source of religious legitimacy. Now, one question you might be thinking about here, the temples were associated with religion. They were also associated with political rulers. What about the mosques? Now, in India, in this period, mosques were definitely religiously very potent, but they were politically inactive. So that's the difference between Hindu temples and mosques in this period. The Hindu temples are also very political. The mosques are religiously very important, but not so political. And so when you had examples, for example, of Hindu rulers taking over Muslim kingdoms, so for example, Shivaji takes over the Muslim kingdom of Bijapur, Krishnadevaraya himself took over the Muslim kingdom of the Bahamanis, you don't see mosque desecration in the same way that you see temple desecration. So I think that's one point to sort of highlight in the context of the Indian history, that if we do see these instances of desecration, it tends to be more of the Hindu temples than of the mosques. I should point out this is actually different to what you're seeing in the contemporary Indian scenario, but maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. What was the religious policy of the Muslim rulers? So in that 200-year period, you had several rulers. The outstanding ruler in that period was a gentleman called Akbar. And he is called Akbar the Great, Akbar the Enlightened, because he was a Muslim ruler who ruled between 1556 and 1605 through military strength. All the rulers who ruled before him ruled through military strength. And Hindu subjects were asked to pay a poll tax or a jizya, which was 10 days of their earnings. But they also paid, very importantly, a pilgrimage tax. Now, this pilgrimage tax was in order to go and visit a Hindu temple, and construction of new temples was forbidden, but very few Muslim rulers actually engaged in persecution or the forcible conversion of Hindu subjects. Now, just to give you an idea of the pilgrimage tax, it was roughly about 2 rupees, and we don't have records of that for this period, but we do have records of that around 1830, when the British actually started recording the pilgrimage tax, and actually the East India Company earned a lot of money out of that. So they kept it for another 100 years, in their rule over India. But this was actually a very important source of income. So that's something I'm going to come back to a bit later in the talk. Now, Akbar was the enlightened ruler because he abolished the poll tax, and he actually made donations to Hindu shrines. There's wonderful accounts of how he donated a golden umbrella to a temple in the North Indian kingdom of Punjab, and the ulema, the Muslim clerics, were very upset about this when he did this. But he was a very enlightened ruler. Now, his policy of tolerance towards minorities and so towards the population and so forth continued under his son Jahangir, and then under his grandson Shah Jahan to a degree. And for those who may be familiar, if you've seen pictures of the Taj Mahal, that was actually built by Shah Jahan, Akbar's grandson. So the policy broadly of religious tolerance occurs under Akbar, it occurs under Jahangir, it occurs under Shah Jahan. And then you see a complete change in the religious policy of Muslim rulers in India with Shah Jahan, with the Shah Jahan's son Aurangzeb, who comes to the throne in 1658 after a very violent struggle with his brothers. And at this point, religious tolerance essentially vanishes. When he comes to the throne, he has an edict in 1659 banning Hindu temple construction. He reimposes the poll tax on Hindus in 1679, and he also, very worried unworryingly provides explicit orders to provincial governors to destroy, Hindu temples and to destroy schools. So there is really a big change in the policy under some of these emperors who were less tolerant than others. Now, this is a picture of the Somnath temple in Gujarat, which is in the west in India, and this is a temple that was repeatedly desecrated. And for those of you who are maybe have an interest in 19th century British historical detective novels, there's a very famous book called The Moonstone, written by Wilkie Collins. And for those of you who've read that book, the Moonstone, you'll remember, is not actually a moonstone, it's a diamond. And that diamond is supposed to have been taken from the forehead of the idol of this temple, the Somnath temple in Gujarat in 1024, when Muhammad of Ghazni, sacked the temple. So this is one that was subsequently rebuilt in post-independent India, but it's just to give you an example of the kinds of temples that we're talking about. So in our data set, we are looking at temple desecrations, Hindu temple desecrations under Muslim rule. And in order to go back and look at the data on this, we were really only able to find 80 events of temple desecrations that took place between 1192 and 1730 that are established with historical certainty. And here we rely on Richard Eaton. Now, as you can see, this number is pretty low because if you're looking at the contemporary political discourse in India, and you read newspaper articles published in Indian papers at the moment, they will routinely, many politicians will routinely say 60,000 temples were desecrated under Muslim rule. And of course, when you go back, the numbers are nowhere in the ballpark of 60,000. We found 80. And what do we mean by historical certainty? And here again, we rely on the historians. Historical certainty means that we have a written account of that desecration from contemporary literature, a written account from the contemporary literature in that period. Now, this is definitely, maybe, fewer desecrations than what you think might have happened. Maybe there are fewer desecrations than what might have happened, but we felt that it was actually quite important to go with the ones where we definitely know the desecration of the temple happened and we have a written account of it. And we have those accounts from, people like Amir Hassan and Amir Khusro, travelers to India who wrote long accounts about when these desecrations occurred. So in our sample, the probability of temple desecration in all periods is about 0.7%. We found temples were generally treated as state property, they were generally protected, and they were maintained. But that was broken in periods of social turmoil and agrarian distress. So between 1660 and 1670, following a period of severe drought, Aurangzeb, who I just talked about, who had the different policy, he ordered the destruction, for example, of the Keshav Deva temple in Mathura, largely because there was a rebellion going on in that area, and the head of that rebellion was associated with this particular temple. So what did the pattern of temple desecration look like in this period? So if you look first at the top, if you look at the timing of the desecrations, you have about 30% of the desecrations in our sample occurring during the imperialism of the Delhi Sultanate. You've got about 38% occurring during the growth of the regional sultanates. And then during the period which has the consolidation of Mughal authority, you have another 31%. Now, if you're thinking about who are the people who actually did the temple desecrations, well, it was the emperor or the crown prince, the governor or the nawab, or a military commander. And at the bottom of the table, you've basically got, two of the rulers in our sample who committed many desecrations relatively to others. So one was Aurangzeb, who I've spoken about. So 10 of the desecrations were in our sample are either by him or some of his commanders. So we need to take that into account in our analysis. And the other, a person who committed a lot of desecrations was a king called Sultan Sikandar of Kashmir. He's actually called, Sikandar the iconoclast, and he committed 3 of the desecrations in our sample. So that's just to give you an idea of what our data here look like. Now, what we do is taking this historical data on the 80 desecrations, we compile a unique georeference data set on medieval India, which is spanning 5 centuries from 1192 to 1730. And our data set includes information on medieval temple locations, the desecrations, the polities, so the political polities to which they belonged, battles that occurred between Hindus and Muslim kingdoms, as well as weather fluctuations. And we begin our analysis with this survey of medieval temple desecrations that was compiled by the historian Richard Eaton. He published a very famous paper in 2000 in the Journal of Islamic Studies, and where he documented these desecrations very carefully. So we start essentially with his work. Now, what our data set then does is, so Eaton identified these 80 temple locations that observed a desecration. And, as we have for these, the location, the year, and the perpetrator. But in some sense, this is really a lower bound because we're quite strict in the definition of temple desecrations. We wanted strictly contemporary epigraphic and literary evidence. But what Eaton didn't have was, of course, the temple locations that were not desecrated. And that's where, our team comes in. Essentially, what we then did was to create a universe of medieval temple locations from the Atlas of Medieval India by Schwartzberg and others. And we superimposed a series of maps of religious and cultural sites. There were 12 maps in total on territorial maps of modern India, so that we could then identify religious sites for the first period, religious sites for the second period, different locations. We matched Eaton's desecrated temples with the temple locations, and there are 80 desecrations at 66 sites with 12 which have multiple incidents. So overall, we have 213 different religious sites over a period of 54 decades. Now, this picture just gives you an idea of where all of these are. So the red dots here are all the temple locations that were desecrated, and Surat over here in the corner, the picture I showed you is one of them. The blue dots are essentially the temples that were not desecrated. So you can essentially see that many of these desecrations occurred all over India, and the temples also are located all over what we think of as contemporary India. What we then did, once we had established the religious sites, was to look at the political dynasties and their territorial rule. Again, we took this from the Atlas of Medieval India. And here we were able to identify 60 polities in this period for medieval India. And so we can then identify the polity where a temple was located in a given decade. And our sample in the baseline is 7,678 observations where we can match the religious sites to the polities. Now, one thing I should mention here is that because we're using these medieval maps and mapping it onto modern maps and things like this, we can only match about 70% of the sample. And this is something that we are still working on at the moment, but there are certain reasons why you can't map every single religious site to the polity. So one of the reasons is that you've got these medieval maps, which you are putting onto the modern maps. And sometimes the medieval maps and the modern maps don't always match up exactly. The other point is that some of the temples that we are looking at in India actually are in very remote areas. They're in places like caves. And because they're in caves, you can't identify them with any particular polity easily. And then some of the polities are actually too small in order to feature in the maps. Now, in the robustness checks, we try and deal with the fact that we are not able to match every one of the religious sites to the polities. But as I said, we are able to match about 70%. So that is all the results I'm going to show you are going to be only for the religious sites where we are able to match the polities. We're hoping to work on this a bit more to be able to find other ways, hopefully, in which we can match some of the ones which are in these remote areas. But because we are actually working with medieval data, this is still take a little bit of time. What we also collected in this project was the religion of the state, the location of the capital, the tenure of the ruler, so how long they ruled, as well as the year in which the polity actually collapsed as well. Now, because the main thesis of the paper is to sort of draw links between weather fluctuations and the temple desecrations, we also needed data on the temperature fluctuations. And here we're using actually a well-known source on temperature fluctuations that's been compiled by geologists and climatologists. There was the famous paper published in Science in 2009 by Mann et al. And many economists have used this data set, including Nathan Nunn, James Penske, Namrata Kala, and others. So we're using, essentially this data set. Basically, the data is based on a climate field reconstruction approach. And so what that is basically doing is that it's just taking paleoclimatic studies that calculate historical temperatures. And the way they get the historical temperatures in these studies is from tree rings, marine coral, ice core, sediment, and other long-run instrumental records over a period of about 1,500 years. And they've done this for the entire world, which is why people in different parts of the world are using these Mann et al. Data. And what they actually provide in these data is average annual temperature for 5-degree latitude by 5-degree longitude grids yearly from 500 to 1959 CE. Now, if you're thinking about 5-degree by 5 latitude by 5-degree longitude grids, immediately you're going to think, that's actually quite coarse if you're trying to look at specific countries. But just to sort of to let you know that in the Indian case, this gives us about 20 grid points across India. It is coarse, but it gives us about 20 grid points. And these historical temperature data are essentially reported as deviations measured in degrees Celsius from 1961 to the 1990 mean temperature. So what we do is using GIS, we're essentially matching the yearly temperature data for each temple location in each year, and then taking the decadal deviation average. So essentially what we're doing is to compare the temperature in a location in a given decade to the distribution of that temperature over the whole sample. Now, one point I should mention is, why are we actually doing this at the decade level? So there's a number of reasons. So one, as I mentioned, the temple desecration itself is a rare event. And so we thought that rather than doing yearly, it is better to do to aggregate them to the decade level. The other issue here also is that, given that we are getting the temple desecrations data from historical accounts, they may not always know if the temple desecration occurred in 1342 or 1343. And so essentially what you do want to do is, so again, doing it by decade is better, so that you're not dealing with, just in case the historical account doesn't pinpoint the date exactly within that year. And then, of course, as many other scholars, economists have pointed out, the temperature data are actually much better at, are not very good at lower frequencies. And so most people who are using this data are actually using it at the decadal, at the decadal level. So just to sort of clarify what we're doing here with the temperature data. Now, you might be worried that in some sense, the temperature values here are simply being interpolated from a very limited set of proxies. As I said, we have, the 20 grid points. And so you might have spatial correlation between the various values. And so in this project, what we also do is we hunted this down. It took us quite a long time to find it. A second data set as well that's reconstructing summer precipitation. This is the work by Shriya et al., which looks specifically at Asia, and which looks again at tree ring proxies and historical documentary records to create rainfall estimates from 1470 to 1920. And this is at a better, grid resolution than the Mann data. But of course, we don't have this for the entire period of 1192 to 730. It's only for this, period from essentially 1470 to the end of our period, 1730. So I'll show you some results with the precipitation data that we do use, but bear in mind again, it's we're essentially using what we are able to find for this period. Now the precipitation data again are testing if the baseline findings, which are based on temperature, which I'm going to show you, are robust to using an alternative climate proxy at a finer resolution. And what we also do in the work, in the results that I'm going to show you, is that that we're allowing for spatial clustering and serial correlation in the standard errors, with the radius varying from 200 kilometers to 1,500 kilometers using the algorithm which has been specified in this excellent paper by Colella, Tony Gend, and others. Again, we're using GIS. We match the precipitation data for each temple location, and again, for the reasons I outlined earlier, we're taking the decadal average. So let me now talk about, what exactly is our empirical framework? What are we actually doing in the paper? Now, first off, I should say that we are using a linear probability model. The main reason for doing that is, as I explained, the temple desecrations are a rare event, and the features of this model are better, I think, in dealing with the fact that we have this rare event that we're investigating. So in our work, temple desecrations essentially is a dummy variable that equals 1 here if the desecration recorded at the temple location I in polity K in period T. We have a variable M that we're calling Muslim rule. That's a dummy which equals 1 if the temple location I was under Muslim rule in period T. We have the variable T, which is essentially temple temperature deviations. This is a dummy variable which equals 1 if the temperature deviation recorded in period T was either at the top or the bottom quartile of temple location I's sample. And so the main variable of interest for this paper, at least, is beta 3, which I've marked here in red, which is essentially Muslim rule into temperature deviation. So beta 3 is simply the increase in the probability of temple desecrations under Muslim rule in a period of what we define as large weather fluctuations. Now, I should mention that when we're thinking about large weather fluctuations, we're saying that the temperature deviation should be in the top quartile or the bottom quartile of the temple location I sample. In the robustness checks, we also vary that to look at 20%, 30%, other percentages. But for the purposes of the results that I'm going to be showing you, we're defining the temperature deviation and the essentially as if this was recorded in the top or the bottom quartile of temple location I sample. I think there might be a question from Renata.
Yes, thank you. So do you have any measure of size, temple size?
No. It's a great question. We don't have a measure of temple size, largely because this project was not collecting. So we know the location, the perpetrator. We don't have a measure of the, because in terms of their donations and other things. I should say that I do have that information for work that I'm doing on contemporary India, but we don't have, unfortunately, on temple size. Of course, we know from the names of the temples, which are considered some of the holier places in, which were important places of pilgrimage. And I'll say a little more about the pilgrimage sites. So there are some temples, for example, like Gaya and Allahabad, Tirupati and others, which are major pilgrimage centers. And, I will say something about those pilgrimage centers. So those are bigger because they're charging the tax. They're essentially getting many more devotees. But no, we don't know. I mean, these are certainly not village temples. I mean, that's the one thing I think we can establish, because they feature in Eaton's accounts and they feature in the accounts of Amir Hassan and Amir Khusro. So they were significant temples in that people went to them. It wasn't like a little temple to Ganesha at the end of a road that you see in every village in India nowadays. But there is no sort of official kind of way in which we can measure them apart from their reputation.
When you say that you still observe them in the records, in the more recent records you can access, so were they all reconstructed somehow, or they were like completely destroyed to become like anything because they were strategically located somewhere?
Yes. So it's a great question, Renata, and this is exactly what our paper is kind of speaking to. One of the things we are arguing is that we are arguing that actually the Muslim rulers were strategic in which temples they desecrated and which they didn't. And my thesis, and this is contrary to what, as I'm going to argue, to what the historians say, is that I actually think many of them didn't desecrate a lot of the temples because of the pilgrimage tax, and and because they were earning a lot of income, from those temples, and that the ones they desecrated tended to be in the areas where they were moving into new territories. But I will be, showing you some of those results in a minute as well. There were many temples that were rebuilt, but they were not rebuilt under Muslim rule. They would only be rebuilt if a Hindu kingdom came in between two Muslim rulers. And many of these temples actually were finally rebuilt only in post-independent India under Jawaharlal Nehru and others. So they weren't even rebuilt under the British. They were actually rebuilt, many, many, many decades, in some cases, like Somnath, many, many decades later. But thank you very much for your excellent questions. Okay, so the main variable we're interested in is, of course, beta 3, the Muslim rule into the temperature deviations. What we also look at is other controls in the regression, such as the distance of the temple location to the capital. Because if a temple was very, very far away from the capital, a ruler might not worry so much about a rebellion happening there. Whereas if it was close to the capital, it was threatening them, and so they may be more worried. We're also looking at Muslim dynasty length, so whether the duration of the Muslim polity K had been in power in the period T or not. And then we have a series of fixed effects. We're looking at, for example, in the case of Somnath, it's located in a very famous port. And it could be the temples that were in the ports were more likely to be desecrated by invaders coming from outside or from people inside, because the ports were actually very wealthy. So we have these sort of location fixed effects. We're looking at period fixed effects because there may be broader changes in military or agricultural technologies. And we're also looking at dynasty fixed effects, because one of the things that is interesting about South Asia in particular is that there are lots of unobserved polity characteristics, which is the type of Islamic jurisprudence. Now, the Sunni jurisprudence, for example, does actually differ in its treatment of religious minorities compared to Shia jurisprudence. And in India, the main school that was influencing a lot of the rulers was the Hanafi school. And the Hanafi school actually advocates a very conciliatory approach towards minorities and Indic religion. So these are all factors, of course, we also want to take into account in our work. Now, here, this is basically just, a very simple picture that is showing you the weather fluctuations and the temple desecrations. It's simply historical temperature data in degrees Celsius from the MAN data reported in deviations from 1961, 1990 mean temperature. The desecrations are in, by decade in green, and the red is the temperature deviations. One thing I should point out, if you just look over here, is that the decade average means are below 0. And what that actually means is that the period that is under study, this medieval period in India, is relatively cooler than the modern period. And of course, that is consonant with the current debates about climate change. We would expect this period to be cooler on average than the current period that we are living in. So let me just show you very quickly what our baseline results are showing is that the likelihood of temple desecration under Muslim rule during a weather shock increases by 0.4 percentage points relative to the sample average of 0.65%. I should mention the standard errors here are being clustered across religious sites within the polity. And the top panel is essentially showing you the results for just the baseline results for the full sample. The bottom panel is excluding the iconoclastic rulers. You will remember that I mentioned that Aurangzeb and Sikandar were two of the rulers who had a religious ideology that was driving, in some senses, their temple desecrations. So what we also wanted to do is to exclude Aurangzeb and Sikandar when we're presenting this. And clearly you lose about 402 observations when you're removing the iconoclastic rulers. But this is just something that we wanted to look at, because we know that for this particular issue, the iconoclastic rulers are important. The question is, how do we explain the temple desecrations, and what is our story here? So our story essentially is, and I'm going to show you the results of that now, is that as I explained earlier, this is maybe driven by weather shocks and changes to agricultural productivity, and we are going to say it may also be driven by regime characteristics. And after presenting, what is our story with respect to these findings, I'm also going to talk about the alternative stories that historians and others have also suggested may be important for explaining temple desecration, so we can evaluate all these explanations collectively. So what's our mechanism?
Shriya, sorry,
yes.
Before you go on, you did mention briefly that your data also tells you who desecrated, so the perpetrator. So you do know for a fact that this was someone from the political rulers, not a local conflict or okay.
Yes. We have the exact name, the location, how many times, because some temples were desecrated repeatedly. We know exactly who the person was who went into the sanctum sanctorum and sacked the idol, or destroyed the building. We know the exact names,
so
which is why the numbers are small.
Local conflict, right?
And yeah, exactly. So this is why we kind of were quite strict with ourselves in terms of the number of temple desecrations. We didn't want to go on sort of hearsay in terms of, oh, there was a temple destroyed in that area. We needed to know, who actually did it and when. It's actually a very good question, Raphael, also because, when you're looking at reading the historical literature on these desecrations, we were looking at contemporary accounts, but actually because the British came after the Mughals, you actually have a lot of revision, rewriting of history that goes on in the British colonial period in India, where British writers write about temple desecrations that happened in the Mughal period, many of which never happened at all, but were just written in order to make the British look good relative to the Mughals. They were trying to portray themselves as, benign towards the Hindus compared to the Mughals. So we don't trust the British accounts. So we didn't use those. I mean, we can use those, but we were a bit worried about that. So we've just basically stuck to, anybody describing a temple desecration.
Cannot trust the British then. Okay.
I agree. Okay. Okay, so anyway, but on that's on a lighter note. So essentially, what we're arguing is that these weather shocks decrease agricultural productivity. This increases the risk of rebellion, and this might increase religious repression. Now, ideally, if we want to do this analysis as good economists, what would we want? We would want agricultural productivity in that medieval period, and we would want the duration of the revolts data. Now, before I proceed, I think Tanya has a question.
Yes, I do. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have just one question. Are you considering this relationship between the weather shocks and the agriculture productivity shock just in this way, or are you considering also any kind of change in the agricultural technology that was going to bring some change in the results, because you're considering a long period, right?
That's right. It's a very good question. So I was just going to explain. So ideally, you're right. We need the agricultural productivity. Ideally, we would need changes in agricultural technology that happened over time, and we would need the duration of the revolts. Now, in our analysis, we're looking at productivity in terms of soil quality, but as of yet, we have not brought into this, wide changes in agricultural technology. We're kind of assuming our fixed effects kind of, controls for some of the wider changes in technology, but we're not specifically looking at, agricultural technologies that would have definitely evolved over time. So because it's medieval data and we don't have the data for agricultural soil quality for that period, what we're doing is really measuring that with a degree of error, because there is a wider, scientific literature that suggests that better soil quality does reduce the negative effect of weather fluctuations on agricultural productivity. So drawing from that literature, what we do is actually say, okay, given that we can't measure soil quality in those temple locations in that period, we can measure it with error, because the temple locations have remained fixed, looking at the contemporary soil quality, though we know it is measured with error. So what we actually do is we use NASA data on these Earth observing systems data and information systems data on gridded soil characteristics. And what is very good about this NASA data is that they have a spatial resolution of 10 by 10 kilometers. And what we try to do in this paper is essentially to measure better soil quality through two factors that these data allow us to do. We look at nitrogen density and carbon content, essentially to construct the average nitrogen and carbon density level for every temple location I using a geospatial software. Now, why do we look specifically at nitrogen density and carbon content? Well, coming to my life as a real world development economist, we know that if we're looking at contemporary agriculture, one of the big issues that people are looking at is things like carbon sequestration strategies, where you put more carbon into the soil so that you have less carbon in the air, and that this is actually very good for climate change. So we know that carbon content, nitrogen density is a very good indicator of soil quality. And so what we're arguing here is that we can tell which temple locations were actually in areas which had better soil quality on average. Did that actually have any effect on our results? And basically, this is what our results were showing, that the locations with better soil quality were less likely to experience temple desecrations under Muslim rule during adverse weather shocks. And you can see this, in the top panel, whether you're using the nitrogen density measure. So we're obviously interested in the triple interaction, whether you're looking at the nitrogen density measure or the carbon density measure. To be honest, I remember when we first looked at these results, we were quite surprised we were actually getting any significance at all, given that we've got only the 80 temple desecration, but we were kind of encouraged that there's some evidence here for our thesis. Again, let me mention that the soil quality is, measured with error, because this is contemporary, carbon density and nitrogen density rather than, what happened in that medieval period. But our feeling also was because we were interested in sort of broader geographical variations. What was important was for us to establish, is the Gangetic Plain in the north different from the Deccan Plateau in the south? And that over the long period of time, I think you can still do, even with these data. Now, and that's something that, we wanted to do. However, as I said, because the temperature data were, at a coarser level, what we also, just to bolster our analysis, to understand this a little better, we also did a case analysis within the work. Yes.
Let me just stop you there. So it's also related to the same question. What about crops, right? Because I'm guessing that regional crops could be affected differently by these shocks. And do you have any data on that, or did you check that?
I think it's a great suggestion. So we haven't collected, so because our focus was the temple desecrations and looking at the weather shocks, we haven't collected crop data. I don't know if crop data for this period will be available. We certainly will be able to find crop data for the British period, but that's many hundreds of years later. One possibility, actually, it's quite a great suggestion, Rafa, that we can maybe look at differences in the variation of the crops in subsequent periods and somehow use that here. I mean, we know broad changes that, Punjab grows wheat and, South India grows rice and that kind of thing. And that has not changed over time. Historically, that's always been the case. And you've got jawar and bajra and others that are grown in the middle. So, I mean, that we know, and that would have been grown, historically as well. But precise data on who was growing what in which region for this period, we don't have it.
Because so the question in my head is the following. So of course your regional fixed effects will capture that, but I mean the differences in crop choices, but it will not capture the fact that the shock has a different effect on these regions because they have different crops, right? So in this if you think in this way, then perhaps this is something to be investigated. But yes, I mean, I understand the difficulty with data and everything.
Yeah, no, but having said that, the tax that was actually being imposed, regardless of what crop you grew, was basically on the size of the land holding. So these people were being asked to pay the tax regardless. So yes, I appreciate that, the effect of the shock may actually be quite different in these various regions. But what we're also, given that they were taxed, what we're we're also hoping is that, in some ways, the temple desecration instances may also be reflecting some of that insecurity as well. So we, I think that's actually a very fruitful area for us to take. As I said, this is still a project that's in progress. So we're very grateful for any suggestions and things to look at. And certainly, I think both your point as well as Tanya's point made previously about the technology. These are two things we should probably, investigate a little bit more. But at a more local level, because we also did want to try and do that, we wanted to look at specific agrarian rebellions as well. So there's again not much data, but because there's no systematic data on these rebellions. But what we do have is one data set by Rana, which has village level records of rebellions across Parganas, which are sub-districts in two provinces of Ajmer and Agra. And so what we did is essentially to create a cross-sectional data set of these rural rebellions in these 66 Parganas in these provinces. And then we matched the Parganas to our proxies for fluctuations in soil quality using this time the precipitation data, which actually has enough cross-sectional variation at that Pargana level. Of course, we're looking at a very limited period. We're looking at 1670 to 1730, for which the precipitation level for the Pargana was either in the top or bottom quartile of its precipitation sample. And again, we're testing whether having more decades of weather fluctuations increased the rebellion duration and whether this effect was mediated by soil quality or not. And what we're finding is that controlling for soil quality, an additional decade of larger weather fluctuations increases the rebellion duration by approximately 3 years, compared to a sample average of about 38 years. And what we're also able to show just for this smaller case study is that the effect of the weather shock on the total rebellion duration dampened in those Parganas with higher soil quality. But again, this is a small case study, but at least it's kind of reassuring that this soil quality mechanism that we're suggesting is here. We're at the moment still on the lookout for other similar kinds of historical studies that might have the data that we can then use. Now, the weather and the soil quality is sort of one mechanism that we're suggesting might have been important for these temple desecrations. But of course, regime characteristics are going to be, we feel, quite important as well. And what we're finding here is that the older Muslim states were less likely to desecrate a Hindu temple during periods of weather fluctuations. Why is that the case? Because Muslim dynasties that were in power for longer were less likely to experience revolutions. And we know that older dynasties in general may have a stronger military, and therefore that's one reason why they may not desecrate more. They may also have a fiscal system to absorb the negative consequences of agrarian shocks, which means that they might be able to provide tax concessions, for example, in the events of crop failure. So what we're also doing is looking at dynasty length as a proxy for state capacity, and looking to see whether weather shocks and longer dynasty length lead to a decreased threat of rebellion and lower religious repression. We're also looking not just at how long the dynasty was actually in power, but also specific rulers, because one of the things that happens when you read this history of South Asia in this period is actually how dangerous it was. Indo-Muslim rulers were particularly susceptible to rebellion at the onset of the tenure, mainly because there was an absence of fixed rules of succession, and that meant that often you had very, very violent transitions. So just to give you an example, we'd mentioned the Emperor Aurangzeb, who was the one who had the big change in religious policy. So he was one of 4 brothers. And when Shah Jahan wanted to give up the throne, he actually wanted Aurangzeb's eldest brother, Dara Shikoh, the eldest son, to take over the Mughal Empire. And the imperial court also wanted Dara Shikoh to take over. Aurangzeb, as the younger sibling, with the support of the religious clerics, essentially didn't do a very nice thing. He killed Dara Shikoh, he killed all of his other brothers, and he put his father Shah Jahan in prison. He put him in the palace opposite the Taj Mahal so that he could stare at it, until the end of his days. And that's how he succeeded to the throne. So, you have these really terrible stories of violent transitions that are actually happening in these Mughal kingdoms. And so one of the things we've also wanted to look at is that in this Mughal period, what was the cause of death? And essentially, the probability of you being assassinated was highest in your first 5 years in the job. So there's a robust negative relationship between assassination probability and ruler tenure. So one of the things we also wanted to look at in the context of this broader study was if you had weather shocks with longer ruler tenure, did this actually decrease the threat of rebellion and decrease religious repression as well? And that's what this table is essentially showing. In the top panel, we're looking at the temperature deviation interaction with dynasty length, and then in the bottom panel with ruler tenure. And what it's showing essentially is that the older Muslim dynasties in power for longer were less likely to desecrate temples during these adverse weather shocks, as are rulers who essentially had longer tenure. So essentially, when they were less insecure about their tenure, they were also less likely, we feel, when there was the weather shock, to actually desecrate the temples. So that is sort of our story, that many of these temple desecrations, in addition to the cultural and the political factors, may have been driven by weather shocks and agricultural productivity. They may have been driven by some of these regime characteristics. But of course, the historians and the others have talked about, many other possible channels that you might think of for why these temple desecrations occur. And I want to talk about 3 of those alternative mechanisms and what we found on some of these alternatives. So one of the alternatives is simply scapegoating. One of the alternatives is that these temples were simply being looted for their wealth. And one of the arguments is that they were simply collateral damage. So a bit like what's going on now with Russia and Ukraine, that the temples are simply getting destroyed because everything in that region is being bombed. So let's think about these 3 alternative explanations to our story. So one story, of course, and which has been used, I think certainly Johnson and Koyama talk a little bit about this in the context of Jewish persecution in European medieval societies, that if a community is actually doing well, sometimes it's just being scapegoated. Now, what we argue in the Indian case here is that scapegoating is probably not a very good explanation for these temple desecrations, just because of the demographics. The Muslim rulers, in this case, are ruling over Hindu majority populations. And in 1600, there were only 10 to 11% of the population who were Muslim. Even today in India, although it's the most significant minority in 150 million people, Muslims are only 15% of the population even today. So we actually think that scapegoating of a minority is not the argument. It's probably quite an unlikely argument in the Indian context. It may be a good explanation in other medieval European contexts or other contexts, but we don't think that if Muslim rulers are ruling over Hindu majority populations, that scapegoating is really the explanation. So we don't put much credence on that one. What we also show in our work is that the Muslim states were no more likely to desecrate wealthier temples under their rule, so they didn't actually plunder the Hindu temples for their wealth in response to a shock to tax revenues. And I'll show you some results on that in a minute. And that we also show that weather fluctuations did not increase the intensity of Hindu-Muslim battles and collateral damage, in these temple desecrations. So let's talk about, some of these mechanisms, because, by far, if you read the historical accounts and if you read, if you think about the current political discourse in the subcontinent, looting is always put forward as the main reason why these temples were desecrated, that these temples were essentially repositories of great wealth, and that people were basically just plundering these temples for their the jewels and the wealth that they stored in the temples. And so there's a very famous quotation from the Indian historian Irfan Habib, who wrote a book about Muhammad of Ghazni in 1981. He describes Muhammad of Ghazni's sacking of the Somnath temple, the picture that I showed you, in 1024, where he says not 100 part of the gold and precious stones he obtained were found in the treasury of any king of Hindustan. Just to give you an idea of how rich these temples actually were at that time. Now, it could be that the agrarian shocks that, with the weather fluctuations and so forth could have increased the economic incentives for looting the temple. So we can't, rule out that possibility. That could be a potential explanation for why, these temples were could have been looted. But, the thesis that, our team is trying to really think much more deeply about, and actually which hasn't been looked at too much in this context, is we couldn't really understand the looting explanation, because the Muslim rulers who had these temples under their jurisdiction actually benefited by controlling the pilgrimage economy by charging these pilgrimage taxes. Now, when we looked at these returns that they were getting from pilgrimage taxes in the British period around 1830, they were earning, huge quantities of money on certain sites. And this was, so given they were charging 2 rupees for the pilgrimage tax, we have estimates that in the temple of Tirupati in 1840, they were earning 120,000 pounds. And one pound is 100 rupees. They were earning 99,000 pounds from Jagannath temple. They were earning, 450,000 pounds from Gaya. Now, the British were actually, and the East India Company at that time was actually earning so much money from these temples, they actually kept the pilgrimage tax 100 years into their jurisdiction, long after the Mughals were gone. And the only reason the pilgrimage tax was abolished finally in 1840 in India was because the English evangelicals and the British Parliament said that Britain should not be supporting Hindu superstition. And that's when, under great protestation, the pilgrimage tax was in India was ultimately abolished. So clearly there was a lot of income that was coming from these pilgrimage taxes for the Mughal rulers. And so the question that we actually ask many of the historians when we're looking at these data is that the logic for temple desecration doesn't really exist, because why would they destroy an asset in one go and they can't rebuild it? Why would they destroy the asset that is likely to give them a lot of returns in the future? And so that's when we started exploring as a part of the project. We didn't buy the looting explanation entirely. So that's when we started looking at pilgrimage networks as a proxy for the wealth of the religious sites. Now, again, there isn't for this period a lot of information on what we know about pilgrimage networks here, but we did try to get at this using data from the Tirthyatra section of the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is a big epic poem. It's a historical document composed between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century CE. And essentially, the historian Bharadwaj reconstructed pilgrimage routes, and he listed in that study 24 important places of pilgrimage in India. This comes back to Renata's question about, the really big, sites that we know about. Now, in our data set, we were able to match 20 out of the 24 to our data set of medieval religious sites, suggesting that they were still important a whole millennium later. And so we then create a dummy variable equaling 1 if a religious site I is in an important pilgrimage center associated with the Mahabharata. We suggest that these pilgrimage sites may be wealthier because of pilgrimage activity. The looting channel would basically suggest that they would be more likely to have a temple desecration under Muslim rule during an adverse weather shock. And so we interact the pilgrimage site dummy with the main effect, and the main effect is robust to including the triple interaction. So I'll show that to you in a minute. So basically what we're arguing is that we don't think looting may be the main channel driving the weather, this link between weather fluctuations and temple desecrations under Muslim rule. So the pilgrimage data here is basically suggesting that looting may not be the main channel that's driving, this temple desecrations story. And this is where we are differing, from the historians, quite strikingly. So there's another explanation as well that we can look at, and that's collateral damage. And that's simply that weather shocks can affect the frequency of battles. And, Murat and Nathan and Nancy and others have done some work on this, that if you have a decline in agricultural productivity, this increases competition over land. Lower agricultural wages might raise labor supply for military recruitment. We also know that rising food prices is going to raise the cost of maintaining a standing army. So it could simply be that the temple desecrations are, collateral damage that's essentially occurring as a result of battles. And so that's something that we wanted to look into as well. And so this part of the project has really involved looking at the timing and the location of battles and their participants. There is an international source that's available for this called the Dictionary of Battles and Sieges by Jacques. And it lists about 8,500 battles. And in order for a battle to appear in this dictionary, it must be corroborated by at least 2 written accounts. So this particular source is a very good source for battles and sieges, because every battle that's in there is corroborated by 2 written accounts. So, and not just by hearsay. What we did is to take the ones that were relevant to South Asia from the Jacques data and cross-checked it against a secondary source, which was done by an Indian historian, Narvane, which looked at battles between the 15th and the 18th centuries. And we only identified those battles that appeared in both of these primary as well as secondary sources. So again, we were being quite strict with ourselves, and we identified 223 battles, and 60% of those involved at least one Muslim polity as a participant. And then we look at the interaction between the number of Hindu-Muslim battles which occurred within a 200-kilometer radius of temple location I in the period, along with the weather fluctuation dummy. There's no evidence that we find that the weather shocks actually affect temple desecrations by increasing the intensity of the Hindu-Muslim battles. However, it may not just be that the existence of the battle influences the desecration, but it might actually be who wins the battle that kind of matters for the outcome. And so here, what we then looked at, and this was something that Richard Eaton was suggested in his paper, that maybe temple desecrations occurred when Muslim states expanded into Hindu states through battle victories. And the intuition behind this is that if you are a royal temple, you are a legitimizing agent for the Hindu kingship. And if you have an invading Muslim state, this delegitimizes the political authority of the Hindu ruler. I don't want to draw any parallels to what's going on at the moment, but this is obviously something that might happen. The collateral damage of war and who's winning the wars essentially might be accounting for the temple desecrations. So again, what we try to do is we control for the number of battles that are won by a Muslim state against a Hindu state, but we restrict it to within a 200-kilometer radius of the temple location in the particular period. What we're finding is that the Muslim state was more likely to desecrate a Hindu temple in a territory when the likelihood of upheaval was high due to the weather fluctuations. So let me that's what you're essentially seeing in this particular table. So the Muslim win against the Hindu, doesn't really matter so much, but it does seem to matter much more, with the weather shock. And I think, one of the things that's interesting here is that maybe the states were more sensitive to unrest in newly conquered territories. Because one of the things that's interesting is that if you look at the size of the effect here relative to just being under Muslim rule, a temple being desecrated under Muslim rule, if it was in a newly conquered territory, the size of the effect is 4 times more. So we think that maybe, there is something here to the Eaton argument that, this legitimizing argument was important, but it was important particularly in these newly conquered territories. Was more important than desecrating temples under established Muslim rule. And this might actually explain, coming back to Renata's point, why it was that some of these bigger temples were maybe not desecrated so much because they were under these established Muslim territories, whereas the temples that we were seeing being desecrated tended to be in these newly acquired territories in the early years of the Muslim ruler's tenure. And we think that maybe that was really what was going on here. So I'm not going to say too much on the various robustness checks that we're doing on our results, except just to give you a slight flavor, because I also would like to leave a little time for us to get your thoughts on some of these findings. Essentially, we're subjecting these results, because of the data issues and so forth, to a barrage of robustness checks. Obviously, spatial and serial correlation is something that we are concerned about, that the temperature variation could be spatially correlated. So we're looking at, the standard errors being spatially correlated over a radius. I mean, the kernel is being specified from 200 kilometers to 1,500. We're also assuming serial correlation decays over 100 years. It could be, as the European economic historians have suggested, that the type of shock matters, whether it's a positive shock or a negative shock. Is it hotter periods or colder periods that actually, see more desecrations? The European literature has suggested that, cooler climates created greater, persecution. When you're looking at, for example, Jewish minority persecution in Europe, we find essentially with the Indian case that the positive shocks matter more. It's the hotter temperatures that are causing the greater desecrations, as you would as you would expect. We look at alternative definitions of weather fluctuations. So you remember I had identified the temperature deviations in terms of the top quartile and the bottom quartile. We also look at it with the top 20th percentile, bottom 20th percentile, top 30, bottom 30, 35, this kind of thing. Again, the results are robust to, changing that definition of the weather fluctuation. I had mentioned up front that there were, in some cases, for various reasons, we couldn't match the religious site to the polity. So what we tried to do is to assign in the robustness check the nearest, polity to the religious site. In some cases, it would be, non-Muslim. And again, that was one of the checks that we did. We're excluding the temples that are not in the map. So if any temple was desecrated before these ancient maps were created, obviously we're not in a position to know about that because they don't feature in either the ETA data set or in the maps. It could also be that there's the lagged effect of weather fluctuations. If an area is being subjected to prolonged, weather fluctuations, then that could have, some possible effect. So, we look at that, and we are, sticking to our linear probability model for the moment. The marginal effects are similar in the logit model, but clearly they wouldn't be in the conditional logit because you'd get these massively inflated effects. So we're kind of sticking to that, at the moment. So let me just sort of conclude a little bit by saying that, what this paper and this project really is trying to do is look at the relationship between authoritarian rule and religious authority during economic downturns. What we've tried to do is to, take the historical data, but then create a new data set of Hindu temple desecrations under Muslim rule. We feel we're providing some evidence here for heightened religious repression under Muslim rule in periods of large weather fluctuations, and thereby contributing to this wider debate about co-option versus repression and the relationship between religion and politics in some of these medieval societies. Our view is that the reason they might have been undertaking this temple desecration may have been as a way of maintaining, the power of the state. But really where we would like to see our work contributing is really thinking much more about where economics can contribute to some of these broader debates about Indian medieval temple desecrations. I mean, one thing I should say is that we cannot dismiss from the explanations the idea that certain rulers were desecrating these temples purely on the basis of ideology. We cannot dismiss that argument because clearly there was some, like Aurangzeb, that may well have been doing that. But what we're really asking is that to that literature, we look a little bit more at the role of economics. We think it's actually quite important for contemporary public policy in South Asia. As many of you may know, in 1992, there was a very famous mosque in India that was called the Babri Masjid that was in Ayodhya, and on the birthplace of what was thought to be the birthplace of a very famous Hindu god called Rama. That mosque was brought down by Hindu volunteers in 1992. There were huge riots, including in Surat and in all over the country, great loss of life. There was a court case for 27 years. Last year, that court case was finally adjudicated upon, and the land was given to the Hindus, and the mosque and the Muslims were given another piece of land somewhere else to build a new mosque. And the Indian political establishment was essentially part of the groundbreaking ceremony for the building, and they're building a new Hindu temple to the Lord Rama there. Now, you might think at one level that these temple desecrations happened in medieval periods a really long time ago. Very sadly, I think these issues are with us in the subcontinent, even today, and they have caused great loss of life. So we hope that, in studying this particular project and in having some sort of economic lens on it, that hopefully, there will also be some grounds for public policy in this area. But let me stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thanks, Shriya. This is congratulations on the paper for you and your team. This is a tour de force of gathering data from so many different sources and filtering them, cleaning them, and matching them and merging them. I can see already a lot of work that has been done there. So, and also the topic is very, very interesting. So thank you so much. And I open now for questions. If not, I have questions too. So if anyone has questions.
I can stop sharing my screen so that we can,
yes.
I can see. Why don't I do that so I can see everybody?
Very good.
Oh, I have a question, Rafael.
Yes,
so this is, I wonder how migrant were the population by area around that time, and how important that could be for the different theses about hypotheses about why would there be desecration. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, and this is again another great question. So we know that there is sort of temporary migration, in the sense that people are moving around to these pilgrimage sites. That we know because we've got the estimates of the pilgrimage taxes that are being collected at these temples. So people are doing and of course, Indians migrate long distances to go to these temples even today. So definitely we know that this kind of temporary migration for the purpose of religious pilgrimage was occurring. I should actually mention that in the contemporary Indian situation, the only pilgrimage tax that is there in India at the moment is on the Hajj. There is a 5% tax on that at the moment, but apart from that, we don't sort of have them to the same degree. But yes, that we know. In terms of sort of broader migration trends, in terms of population inflows and out in this period, so we haven't collected data on that. Clearly, this is something we can look at. I mean, one of the things, there is a lot of data, of course, on migration in the colonial period, not just the big partition migration, which happened at the time of independence, but there are studies which have looked at that. Medieval period, I have not seen too much on this, but that doesn't mean that we can't, go and collect this. One thing, though, that one can say about migration in the Indian context is that it tends to be typically women for marriage. From wearing my demography hat from years ago, that is one thing you do see in the Indian data. In the modern context, of course, that's different, but historically, women migrated for marriage. So it could be linked to some of these issues, and that may be something for us to look at a bit more.
Could it be weather induced as well? Like caused by weather changes?
I don't think the migration would have been caused by
economic
changes hugely, but yes, because remember, the one thing about India also is that you've got the linguistic diversity, which is a big barrier to migration, even in this period, because the language they speak you've got these 200 different languages and dialects and so forth. So actually, migration is costly because you also have to learn the language of the area that you are migrating to, and that's true, even today. So my sense would be that given that we're also talking about the Mughal period where we didn't have the railways, which the British brought to India, it's a very different kind of time period. So even the act of migration would have been, I think, quite a lot more difficult to go from, say, South India to North India in this period than perhaps it was under the British when they had established, the very extensive rail network. which Latika Chaudhary and others have written a lot about.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So Shriya, since the beginning of the presentation, I had this on my mind that you basically are focusing on, so you had that slides trying to delineate the mechanism, and then you get to the bottom and you say, if the rulers have the same religion as the local religious authority, there is no conflict because they sort of arrange. There is a co-option or whatever the word you use.
Or they try.
Yeah, exactly. But then when it's a different religion, they cannot do that. So it's not clear to me why this would be true. I mean, there's always space for side payments or whatever, some sort of agreement, right? So this is the first question, and related to that is, why is it so asymmetric, in the sense that I think at some point you mentioned, and you're only looking at temple desecrations, not mosque desecration or things like that, right? And you do mention at some point that they are not politically relevant and temples were, but is it really the explanation? And does this change over time? Do we see this in other areas, or is it a specific Indian phenomenon, or how do we think about these things?
Yes, thank you very much, Rafael. So I think in terms of the strategy, so if you look at the King Akbar, for example, he did try co-option initially by giving the donations to the Hindu temples and so forth. So we're not saying that it's either or, we're saying it's easier if you belong to the same religion to try the co-option strategy. We can certainly have examples of Muslim kings who are trying to appease the Hindu majority. But that what we're arguing is that, if it's also the case, like in the case of Aurangzeb, that he needed the support of the religious cleric in order to get the political power, it's easier to take a strong religious ideological position to say, you see, in order to get the political power, and then you have legitimacy with the religious clerics. And this
so
is
he's
why
really catering to the religious, the Hindu clerics that support him, and then so hitting local.
He's increasing his legitimacy with the Muslim clerics as well by taking a very strong anti-Hindu stance. That's really that's the way we're thinking about it. So we're not saying that it's either co-option or not. It's just that may be a strategy if the religions are different. Is what is the point. And on the second question that you had asked, if you just remind me whether it's changed in terms of the potency of the mosques.
Yeah, because you only really talking about Muslim rulers desecrating temples, right?
Yes.
What about the other way around and things like that?
Yes, no, absolutely. So in this period, as we said, it was the mosques are not as politically active as the Hindu temples. However, of course, everything changes, after this period when the British come to India, and when you actually start having populations that are delineated on the basis of caste and religion. So the first demographic census that was done in India in the 1830s, for the first time, included a question on religion and caste. And that's when it fosters, the caste and religion consciousness in the population. After that, what you see, throughout the rest and and of course this is continued in the colonial period and in the post-independent Indian history, is that I think the religious entities, organizations of all religions have actually become, are very religiously significant, and some are associated with political parties and things like that as well. But that's, I think, a more modern phenomena that we've seen in response to the categorization of people then thinking of themselves as, a particular caste or particular religion and so forth. And of course, in my book, which I wrote on the economics of religion in India, which is all about the contemporary religion situation, we interviewed, many hundreds of organizations to talk about the current situation. It's definitely the case that to attract, adherence, as well as the services that they are providing, a lot of this is also done for very direct, political reasons, as well as welfare reasons as well. So the situation that we actually see, I think, today is, actually completely different to this medieval period. So thank you for that particular question, because I think this is probably not just India, but maybe more globally as well. It's coming back to something we talked about a little earlier, sort of competition between religious groups and so forth. It could be that, what we're seeing in terms of the salience of the institutions becoming more political is also related to the, the broader competition you might be seeing between across religions or within religions.
Right. Great. So I think we can stop here. And once again, thank you so much, Sri. We're very happy to have you and to hear of this very interesting paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure and lovely to meet all of you as well. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.